Today we're joined on Capstone's Talent Talks podcast by Luisa Cardani. Luisa's work sits at the intersection on data centres, public policy and regulation. And whilst much of the focus within the sector is on design, delivery and operations, Luisa brings a crucial perspective on how government policy, planning frameworks, sustainability regulation and national infrastructure priorities are shaping the future of digital infrastructure. This conversation further underpins our love of the data center sector, offering a hugely diverse range of careers, and we're looking forward to hearing more about Luisa's career and expertise. Luisa, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hello, Sarah. Hello, Ollie. Lovely to see you both.
Lovely. So let's start off, Luisa, shall we? Talk to us about your journey into data centers.
Yeah, of course. I think similarly to most people, I would say, in the industry, like I'm yet to hear someone say, no, I absolutely wanted to work in data centers when I was a teenager. So most people, I think, sort of stumble upon the industry partly because it's fairly new. It has developed through the years. But also it seems like once you're in the sense that it's an industry that tends to retain the people that it hires because it's so fascinating. So whilst I wasn't looking specifically for a career in data centers, I similarly stumbled upon it. So I have a policy background. That's what I studied. And that's what I did my master's on. And then I ended up doing a bit of a career in PR and then government. I walked in at the time. It was one of the many iterations of industrial strategy in BEIS, which now doesn't exist as a government department anymore. It's been divided between business investment and DASNES, which is the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. And then I took a turn. I ended up working on data protection related matters, GDPR. And as I was looking into data protection, data privacy, we were already starting to see questions around data sovereignty, data localization. And so I started scratching the surface, like where is the data? Where is it physically? Because, when you do policy, everything is very, theoretical. When, you look at regulation, it's all very much in theory, but sometimes you need to, understand the practice. So I went looking around for where the data was being held. And of course, I spoke to telecoms companies and they were all like, no, we don't hold the data. The data is not with us. It's with data centers. And what are data centers? And so that's how I ended up doing what I do. I stumbled upon the sector, and then pretty soon a role opened here at techUK, which used to be Emma Fryer. She's now at CyrusOne. She's very well known in the sector. And so I stumbled upon the role, and I have been there at techUK ever since. And I look after our data center members.
I'm just thinking about some of the timeframes on it as well. What led you to kind of where you are now at techUK? And I guess a lot was changing in and around that kind of 2019, 2020. We had COVID and all of those types of things.
We had Brexit.
Exactly, yeah. And so
yeah.
Did you find that because of some of those things that are just completely, in many respects, unrelated to anything to do with tech and data and all the rest of it, but actually because of that, it meant that there was then suddenly all of these things came to the fore and needed addressing with more kind of, government policy and so on? Was there a bit of a kind of coming together of lots of different elements there?
I think government had just started to, understand a little bit. And when I say understand, I mean, they were probing at the sector. And I think the initial knowledge of data centers, I think, in government, and when I say government, I do mean civil servants, because it's only very recent that government officials, so your MPs and your ministers and your Secretary of States and the Prime Minister talk about data centers. But from a civil servant perspective, really, the sector was mostly known for its environmental permitting because of the backup generation.
Right.
And perhaps some local authorities for planning, definitely some work going along the lines of, digital infrastructure, but there wasn't the same focus as there is now. And most definitely when I moved into the sector, it's on the back or at the very beginning of, due to COVID and due to Brexit, questions around security and resilience more broadly, right? Because quite soon after that, we had the geopolitical crisis of Russia invading Ukraine, energy crisis. And so it was a little bit of a, the sector sort of like a perfect storm found itself in the eye of Sauron, so to speak, because then immediately after you also had ChatGPT and the advent of large language models. So I think, I joined just before all of this started. So I got the very last moments of quiet for the sector before it got projected onto the international stage and the media as it is today.
And from a sovereignty perspective as well, I mean, there's so much changing so quickly, and it feels like these are like huge, decisions and policies that need to be in place in order to kind of protect those types of things and actually, create that roadmap for how things are then going to work moving forward. All of that feels like it needs to happen and is happening very, very quickly. I mean, how are you seeing that, in terms of how that's getting implemented, playing out, and being organized?
I think, most people would argue that, data globalization is obviously something that is, very beneficial for obvious reasons. Localizing data is seen as something very protectionist. However, there will always be workloads that require data sovereignty from a security and resilience perspective, and sometimes due to data protection perspectives as well. So you always had that. It's just now it's becoming a strategic question for government for, given the current geopolitical landscape. But also, I guess it's a matter of, do you want to have your own capabilities at home, right? So I think there's a lot of thinking going into that right now. I think most companies would argue that the less international friction there is, the better for business. But from a government perspective, of course, especially now that we've left the EU, it's been a few years, there is a question about how you want things to work when it comes to not just your own, national regulations, but also how do you want to do business. And in all honesty, I think it's normal to ask yourself questions around data sovereignty. And a lot of our members at techUK are part of those conversations.
So talk to us a bit about the work that you're doing at techUK. Tell us a bit about techUK more broadly, and then specifically your role within it, because I think that's really interesting from a career perspective. It's really, really interesting.
Yeah, of course. So techUK, it sort of does what it says on the tin. It's the trade association for tech in the UK. So our members go from chips to clicks. So we'll have, software developers, your large international companies like Microsoft, Amazon Web Services. You'll have, chips manufacturers, all the way to digital infrastructure, whether it's telecoms, cyber, as well as different sectors within the subsection of tech, so, satellites and, health tech, financial services, fintech. So techUK covers all of that. And then we look at the applications that are the horizontals, right? The technologies across all of these subsectors in tech. So quantum, emerging tech, robotics, AI, the bigger data and digital economy questions, so data protection, AI copyright, so on and so forth. But then I, in particular, as I said, look after our data center members. So under our digital infrastructure team, I'm in particular in touch regularly with our member companies that join techUK, who are operators, the wider ecosystem. So you go from your medium to large colocation providers, all the way to your consultancies, your real estate and law firms. So we do have quite a bit of the data center ecosystem within our membership. And really what we do, what a trade association does, is have a cohesive voice as a sector and engage with key stakeholders, whether that be your government officials, your regulators, your research institutes and academia, all the way to the media. So I often get asked questions from media outlets, and it's my job where there is an agreed position, to make sure that that gets relayed to the media on behalf of the sector. And we work on a number of things. Currently, some of the things we're working on is data centers being in scope of the Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill. So, for example, we go from that all the way to water use and demystifying the sector and trying to work with regulators and government on providing some, initial data to try to prove that perhaps in the UK, data centers are not a water-intensive sector, or at least not to the same extent that is often portrayed by the media, or that other geographies give the sector a slightly less, environmentally friendly reputation. So we do work on, the whole policy spectrum. And lately, no surprise, a lot of work is going on energy and working with NESO, Ofgem, and DESNZ, not just on grid access, so being able to go through the queue, but all the way to energy costs.
Yeah. And if you look at it, can I just ask a quick question about, obviously the data center sector is now a critical infrastructure, and were you involved heavily in that work? I mean, what a thing to be involved with.
Well, it's a little bit at the moment a double-edged sword, right? So with that designation comes also more oversight from government, and a stronger partnership with the sector, which means that they might have asks of the sector that previously weren't there, from providing information all the way to making sure that the government is able to respond as appropriate to certain types of critical national infrastructure incidents. So it's a double-edged sword, but I think it was quite crucial for the sector. As I said, when I joined techUK, the government was really looking at this question around security and resilience. And as they consulted with the sector, we basically told them, please don't do anything bespoke, in the sense of, we want to, these are a lot of our members are international businesses. Europe is still a very large market. So please try to harmonize as much as possible, or align policy where possible with other markets. And so, some countries in the EU already had recognized the sector as critical national infrastructure. On top of that, the sector is in the scope of the NIS regulation there. So when we consulted with government, that was one of our suggestions, right? Could we have the sector recognized for how important it is, and have a better, relationship with government, better engagement, more formalized engagement, right? All the way to, if you're so concerned about a baseline when it comes to security and resilience, perhaps do what's already been done and do it, a little bit better, which TBC, because it's currently going through Parliament.
And are you finding that, some of that friction that might have been there previously, is that because of the work you're doing and others and some of the members and everyone kind of coming together, is that easing? Are you finding that because it is so critical now, everyone's trying to find a way a bit more quickly in order to kind of ensure that, whether it's power, whether it's sustainability, whether it's sovereignty, all of those kinds of things, is that easing a little bit? Is it starting to speed up and become a bit easier?
I mean, I deal with friction in every single sense, because as you can imagine, different companies will have different objectives. So already building consensus within the sector sometimes is easy, sometimes not so easy. So already it's dealing with the friction within the sector of what is a agreeable position for everyone. And then it's dealing with the friction of the other side of the house, which is government, in the sense that, as you can imagine, different government departments have different priorities. And sometimes, unfortunately, those are competing priorities. I always give the example of, we engage with the two different parts of the department, DESNZ, who, it really does lead on both energy security and net zeros. And those two don't seem in contradiction with each other, but when it comes to the data center sector, they are, because, you can ask the sector to be very energy secure, but that leads to, backup generation, and the other side asks for energy efficiency, but also circular economy. So yes, you could, repurpose a building, utilize, recycled tech, servers and what's so not, a longer life cycle, right? Not have always the latest model, but that will impact your energy efficiency. So you can't have your cake and eat it, right? It's all about balance. And sometimes it's really difficult to bring every single player together in a room and try to make them understand this. And this goes across government, right? So some government departments are really interested about international competition, right? How does the sector fare here compared to in other geographies? And other departments, maybe for environmental concerns, would rather have less data centers, which of course, that's not what we want. At techUK, we really support what we call sustainable growth of the sector. We think you can grow the sector in a responsible, sustainable way that is not necessarily at odds with environmental concerns. But it's really hard to land that message. And it's really hard to make people understand what is realistically a very, very technical and historically a bit secretive sector. So, just getting them to be out there and talking. I think a lot of them are doing it a lot more than they used to.
Definitely.
But it's been, a slow bringing people to the table. I think, the sector always said government never listens to us. Well, now they have perhaps a bit too much attention, and especially with AI, right? People equate AI to data centers. Well, the sector often says, wonderful, but most of us still do a lot of cloud. There's more than just AI when it comes to data centers. So yes, there's a lot of friction. And I think also there is a lot of different hopes, right? They seem to bring a lot of investment, but they're not cash cows, right? They're here, they have 10-year leases, when they come, they're here to, build infrastructure and stay, and they need to be able to do so on their own terms, in the sense of, if they want a specific location, there's a reason. If certain customers want certain things, that's for the sector to decide, and not necessarily for government. And I think that's where we had the most friction, which is government now thinking that they can distort the market by asking data centers to go to specific locations, and the build and they'll come no longer really holds true these days. And more importantly, it's not in the data center's gift to give, it's really their customers.
Yeah. And if you look at sustainable, sensible growth, which is obviously what you're kind of advocating for, what does that look like in real terms?
Well, what it looks like in real terms is, realistically speaking, there are some systemic issues in the UK that need addressing. Energy costs being some of them are, a bit of a pain for the sector. I would say for most sectors, it's really, one would argue, if you want to have a thriving economy, you want cheap, reliable, renewable, clean power, and in abundance. And at the moment, we don't have that. It's expensive, and we don't have as much as we ought to have for the rapid electrification of everything. We're going to have electric cars. It's not just data centers. This is the other thing. The beauty of being part of techUK is that we're able to share these messages with government in a way that really does say, this is a really chunky part of your GDP. This is not just data centers, right? Energy costs are impacting everyone. And as we're all digitizing, we're having this call right now. This is a podcast. It's going to be hosted in a data center somewhere. And I think that rapid digitization that sort of started with COVID, it's not going to stop. So it's about recognizing that. So where you can change some of these things, that will ease some of the burden, because if you have a lot of renewable and clean power, then what is realistically the biggest environmental impact of data centers, which is that they are high energy users, would no longer be such a concern. There's a reason why companies love to move to Scandinavia, because they can say, we compute all of our workloads run on 100% certifiable renewable power, which we can't do in the UK because of how the grid is set up. You get a mix, and sometimes you don't really get a choice in that. And so those are some of the systemic issues that, if you were to ease, would allow for that sustainable growth of the sector. It's also true that, data centers have always tried to be environmentally as conscious as possible, because they're all there always to try and make efficiencies. So they try to be as energy efficient as possible for obvious reasons. Power is expensive. You want to use it as wisely as possible. So even things like water use, fantastic innovations have developed in the sector whereby you no longer need to cool using water. You can have direct to chip cooling or closed loop cooling systems. So the sector has always been moving slowly in that direction. What we try to do is ensure that regulation is only there as a baseline, as a guidance for the sector, and then each company should be able to do as much on top of that as they want. I'm sure you speak to some fantastically sustainable companies out there, from whether they provide their excess heat into heat district networks, all the way into whether they build their own reservoirs and improve on the biodiversity of an area. All the way to water reuse, or using different sources of water. So I think the concerns that often the public has about the environmental cost of data centers, especially in the UK, is not the case, and it's just how much more sustainable you can become. And we are reaching the point where really it's for systemic change, not for individual companies to try and, change the way that, the national grid operates. Although we do try. That's the whole point of why we're here as a trade association. We're here to try and change that for the sector and for the wider economy, of course.
And presumably, like that, the trade association, I'm sure, has grown quite a lot in terms of people that are working there, because there's so many people that have that kind of vested interest in being able to, work with government and all the policies that are being put in place, and whether it's sustainability initiatives or it's sovereignty that we talked about before. So presumably you've seen that yourself, and actually, coming through, your pathway into the data center world, I'm imagining that there's now probably a lot more people that are going into that sort of area as well. And it's another example of people working in DC who wouldn't necessarily, when they're at university, have been thinking that I'm studying, public policy and all the rest of it, that are now moving into that sector.
Yeah, absolutely. We're seeing massive interest in the sector from a lot of different areas that, didn't necessarily think of data centers before. Whether we collaborate with other trade associations, especially on the energy side, they do so with us because they have an invested interest in data centers due to the fact that they use a lot of power. So, there is a lot of interest that is growing in those places. But also we're seeing a change where, once upon a time, a data center operator would have, their operations engineers, maybe a couple of people in marketing and sales, chief of staff, but they didn't necessarily have their own head of policy, head of government affairs. And I would argue that, if you're a large data center operator and you don't have someone who does government affairs, you should definitely think of having one, because the saying, you're not interested in government, well, guess what? Government is interested in you. And you need to have someone who can be that interface, who explains in non-technical terms the sector, or at least your company, to your local authority, local government, more widely, central government, and stakeholders, right? Because policy and marketing are becoming more and more tied together, right? I think gone are the days where you could just put out a press release saying new 200 megawatt data center. No, it needs to have more. It needs to be like, what are you doing with the local community? What kind of ESG measures are you considering? And so I think there are really crucial positions. And then you have people like myself who are sort of like the repository of everyone's views. I then, convene everyone and make sure that there is one cohesive view, at least, that I can bring to government. So definitely it's growing. The same way that I think I keep seeing more and more public affairs consultancies, law firms, everyone is sort of waking up to a sector they didn't know was always there.
Yeah, so gone are the days where it's a comms room in a bank, and now it's actually, it's something that has to have these blended narratives, that link in with kind of whether it's public policy, but then externally to kind of narrative in the public domain and marketing and all the rest of it.
Absolutely.
Changed
And
so
it
much.
helps change the hearts and minds, right?
Mm.
So if you have a PR issue, like the sector to some degree has, a little bit because of its secrecy historically, but also because with attention and misinformation is just something that I think most sectors had to go through as they matured. You know, I try to always remind my members, it's not just you, the telecom sector went through it, aviation went through it. So, you know, you need to just like grit your teeth and put your best foot forward, right? When you're invited to speak with government, when you're invited to speak with the media, don't say no, go. Agree internally what you're going to say, have some useful stats, just invite the attention rather than shy away from it, because you know, it just, that's how you win the hearts and minds of people, by showing that you have nothing to hide.
Yeah,
And
and
as
I
it's
think
evolved, sorry.
go on.
I was going to say, as it's evolved as well, there's this much more kind of diverse thought that's coming into it as well, in terms of all these people that are now working within that kind of context, that diversity of thinking and backgrounds and so on, that are coming to the table and having those discussions is also a really good thing, isn't it? As the
Yeah,
industry evolves.
absolutely. Absolutely. So there's brilliant people in the sector that unfortunately are slowly retiring, who started as, you know, electrical mechanical engineers and retired with the title of you know, head of sustainability. So they sort of took on a role that didn't necessarily exist back in the day, just because of the nature of data centers. But now, you know, you have sustainability graduates who would be thrilled to take a job in a data center if they know that the sector exists. And that is the beauty of bringing diversity, because I would say any sector thrives the more diverse talent you're able to bring to the table. Now, I appreciate that some things are just within the nature of certain roles, right? So if you are someone who studied PR, you may not be able to get a job as a mechanical or electrical engineer, but there are apprenticeships. But also, the beauty of working in that environment is you work with the engineers, you translate the really technical language that they use and what they do into your press releases, into your marketing. You know, if you are someone who does, I don't know, law, and you want to try something different, policy is there for you. Why not? We're adjacent practices, right? Or compliance. There's a lot of fantastic roles in compliance, because the more regulation, the more compliance a sector has to showcase. And that attracts talent from lots of different walks of life, from, you know, social backgrounds, ethnic diversity, and also gender diversity. I mean, this has historically been a very male-dominated sector. It still is, but it's changing, and it's changing very rapidly. And we have some fantastic women in the sector who are very keen to get out there and shout that this is a great sector to work for, and to please not be afraid just because it's infrastructure.
I think it was interesting. I was at an event yesterday, one of the women's speaker series with that Katrona Shearer over at JLL runs.
Oh, she's
And
fantastic.
oh, she is, and she's doing some incredible work. And Dame Dawn Childs was the expert advising the panelists on, as well as Joyce Wadey. And one of the panelists that we were discussing around attracting more diverse talent in, and she just phrased it beautifully around, we need to educate the educators, because this isn't a problem of, you know, working women moving in, or, you know, whether it's, or adjacent industries moving in. This is an education piece that comes from that talent pipelining. And, you know, we need to be, you know, it needs to be commonplace that, you know, girls are, you know, are equally represented within STEM subjects, which obviously leads to the kind of more technical routes. But I suppose from a talent perspective, it would be really interesting to hear your take on where the friction points are there in terms of the work and the members that you represent. What conversations are being had around talent, which is obviously what we're obsessed with, but as well as mission critical environment. But yeah, you're probably at, you know, the forefront of hearing where those risks are.
I think it's more the fact that the sector is growing at such a speed that we just don't have the in-house, as in the UK, we don't have the talent pipeline to fill that gap. We don't have it now. We're not going to have it for the projected growth of the sector. So that is definitely a challenge. And the other challenge is, unfortunately, a significant portion of the sector is now retiring. You have these veterans who have been there since day one, and they really need to pass down their knowledge. And, so, that is definitely a pinch that is massively felt. And, I'm not best placed to say whether, there are visa concerns and apprenticeship concerns there, but I definitely have heard that it's not just in the UK. This has been happening globally, but there are geographies where there is a lot more electrical and mechanical engineering talent than in the UK right now. So, for example, our members who have operations in APAC find that they struggle less with finding that type of talent, but they'll struggle to find another type of talent. In the UK, you'll find a lot more managers and, perhaps compliance savvy people, but we're having a lot of, you just don't have you don't have the talent that is aware of the sector in a way ready to fill those roles, because we may have the talent, we just don't know if we do, because they may not have heard or considered the sector. And so what happens often is you have these great sector initiatives like UTC Heathrow trying to put data centers on the map for a lot of young kids. And where that's not possible, they'll have initiatives where they hire veterans because they are mission critical, right? So, there are some skills that naturally fit within that. I was on the Critical Careers podcast, and it was really interesting because right there we had someone who used to be an athlete, and it's the same idea, right? People who are not afraid of constructive criticism of, performance in a certain respect. So, I hope that as the sector opens its doors more and more, the pinch will ease. It's hard for people to know that there's a sector they can go and work for if they don't know there's a sector they can go and work for. And more importantly, it's a sector that is everywhere and it's a stable employer, right? So, why move to London to become an engineer when you can, stay elsewhere and keep that local talent and growth local and, foster the local economy, rather than everyone just trying to move to the capitals. Yeah. And I am mindful that data centers historically have been within the M25, but that's no longer the case. There's massive growth in Manchester, in Wales, in other areas of the UK, and there's plenty of local talent. It's just a matter of whether that talent knows that the sector is there.
Yeah, and if they're going to be prepared for it by the time it arrives.
Absolutely, that is the other challenge, right? Because there's a lot of poaching. A lot of engineers end up in other sectors like computer science and banking. So I think it's about improving the visibility of the sector, improving the reputation of the sector. And you are right, there is a level of skills gap at educational level that unfortunately is really hard to change because education moves really slowly. Changes to the curriculum take decades to see if there's been any significant change. So I think a lot of our members look at things like apprenticeships to fill the gap as they can.
Yeah, and there's been so much, good work that's been done. I think particularly recently in terms of that marketing, if you like, and then the storytelling about the sector externally, and there's people going into schools to talk about data centers, and there's apprenticeships. Absolutely. And there's so much good work happening, but it's a case of, it still feels like perhaps there's in isolation to a degree, and it almost needs to, maybe that's even part of policy centrally, that actually that needs to kind of come through a little bit more into education, so that people are more aware of it. And I don't know if you can kind of see any kind of perceptions externally that could change, that would actually then help that narrative and kind of help people better understand the sector and be more aware of it, and not necessarily negative perceptions, but just perceptions that maybe could be changed to kind of help influence that.
Well, I think it should start at computer science level in schools, right? So when you teach, kids how to open a Word doc and what computer science is, start from the basics, where is the data? Where does the internet live? And
Yeah.
therefore, the critical role that the data center plays within the ecosystem. I think, it's also easy to get distracted by large household brands. If you talk about digital infrastructure, any kid would be able to recognize Vodafone or BT because they have a SIM card. They know what they are. But if you say the word Equinix, Digital Realty, or take, any other colocation provider, they wouldn't know who they are. So there isn't that association, right? If you just tell them Google, they would, but they wouldn't necessarily associate it with digital infrastructure. They'd be like, yeah, Google, the search, function. And that I think is what takes time, is to explain what the sector is in really simple terms and teach kids that, you got one of these, it's a little phone. How do you think that operates? And it's not just about explaining what 5G is or 6G, because we're moving in that direction. But the fact that the cloud isn't in the sky, that it's actual real infrastructure all the way to a server with chips, and that is where the internet lives.
Yeah,
I think that would make some change. Yeah.
It's funny. I panicked about 3 minutes ago because I just felt somebody coming into the room. Thankfully, you didn't see them, but this little hand came up and just stole the iPad from next to me to take it away. And I was just thinking, I'm going to talk to you about data centers after this and exactly where they are. And actually, I've got here the the data center coloring. Oh God, you can't quite see that, I don't think.
Oh
but
yeah,
the
coloring book.
The
Michael
coloring
Gerardo.
books. Michael Gerardo does that. Were stocking fillers this year, and they were just like, what is this data center stuff that you keep talking about? And I was like, your future, that's what it is. But it has to be built in, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think it's just because we've become more and more removed, right? So it's now expected that you connect to the internet in milliseconds, right? Actually, in fact, you're never disconnected. But I remember the time where you had to
the dial-up,
it'll dial up, and that's when you tied that to the phone and to the cabling, and it makes sense.
Yeah,
that's gone. So no wonder that kids don't know. Although I have to say, a lot of Gen Zers know, because if they code, they know. And now, especially when they're environmentally conscious, because there's a lot of net zero concerns. They'll be like, oh, but if I code a certain way, it's going to use more energy and la la la. So actually, they're quite there. They're close to the understanding of the sector. Just sometimes they just lack the word data center in their reasoning, but they know that AI uses a lot of energy. So they might be closer, but they're still somewhat slightly removed.
Yeah, and that's where it comes. Maybe that linking is that educating the educators piece, isn't it? So if we look at where you think the next 5 years, or rather what the next 5 years look like for the sector, what are your predictions?
Oh gosh, I don't
Actually,
have a
5
crystal
years,
ball.
I think. Yeah, I know. I was going to say, I think 5 years is ridiculous in any sector, but especially the data center one. But where do you think it's going in terms of the opportunities and the challenges? And obviously, your position is generally from a UK perspective, but I'd love to hear what your kind of roadmap is.
The way I see it is, it's not my place to comment if there's going to be an AI bubble, but if there were one, at the end of the day, the infrastructure can be repurposed. So I think that when it comes to infrastructure being built, where it has been built consciously in areas with high demand, it has been built in a sustainable manner. If there were an AI bubble, well, guess what? We are still going to stream our TV. We're still going to stream our music. We're still going to have our, podcasts and whatnot. So you can just put cloud in there. Or who knows, the next innovation. I have a colleague here who looks after quantum, and they say every 10 years, quantum is here, but it could be the case. So, definitely, I think the sector will be resilient to some of these potential future challenges, where it has been done, in a conscientious way. Where I think there's a lot of opportunity is in the way that the sector innovates to accommodate rapidly evolving technology. So, of course, we hear about these interesting projects of data centers at the bottom of the sea or in space. Now, those have incredibly large capex. They're not commercially available quite yet. But some of the technology used to develop those might be. And so it'd be interesting how that's going to be deployed within data centers on Earth whilst we try to colonize space, So I think there will be a lot of innovation coming out of these, whether you see them as, pet projects, innovation, pure projects, research and development, they'll bring some of that tech back into everyday life, and it's going to change how we operate. And then the other challenge, I think it's going to stay for a while, is environment concerns around energy use. There's a lot of positive talk about more nuclear power, whether, some people see this as clean power or not. The reality is we just use a lot of power for everything. It's not just your data centers, right? So we need more power. And realistically speaking, nuclear takes about 10 years. So at least in the UK. So I think there's going to be a lot of opportunity in power generation, in diversity of power sources, in how you increase energy efficiency even further. So there's some brilliant digital twin applications out there to help with your workload demands. So there's a lot of opportunity out there. I think it's just, this is a sector that historically has always adapted. And so that is one of the main points that we try to do to government, is where you do regulate, please be as flexible as you can, build that flexibility and that proportionality in regulation, because this is a sector that needs to be able to adapt like that. Because I don't know if you remember when ChatGPT dropped, it literally, it stopped functioning.
Yeah.
It stopped because the demand was so high, right? So they need to be able to respond quickly to whatever the next, innovation might be. And the more these innovations are commercially applicable, the more the demand, and therefore the more the need for data centers. So I think there's going to be a lot of that. And that links to talent. You're going to need to find people who think things differently, a little bit outside the box. You need people who are able to think strategically and connect some of these things. I think gone are the days of an engineer in a data room that only thought about the data room, right? And there needs to be a bit more interlinks between, people who work in data centers. At least I'm noticing it. I work with engineers all the way to the CFOs, sometimes the CEOs of these companies, because everything is becoming so connected.
Yeah, and I think that what you've done today is just opened up such an incredible window, as it were, into a part of the sector policy that is very under talked about, but highly
impacts everyone.
But highly impactful. And I think that, your point to the government around, they need to be this facilitator for the sector, not a blocker, is really, really powerful. And I don't underestimate how huge that task can be, as well as reframing what data centers are to everybody. So
absolutely. And guardrails are important too, because all you need is a couple of cowboys doing things in a dubious way to give the sector a really bad rep. So I think where you want is the bare minimum standard of what is acceptable to everyone, which is beneficial for society, the environment, and then each company specializes in different things. Some companies are incredibly sustainable, others really focus on security and resilience, because they might be hosting government data, they might be hosting, incredibly powerful workloads that are of critical importance. We certainly know some of our members hosted some of the COVID vaccine compute in their data center. You want to make sure that's secure and resilient. So I think that's the beauty, right? You want an environment that sustains growth in a environmentally friendly way, incentivizes investment and innovation as well. And that is the other part of the side, right? Data centers are the confines of the infrastructure, but how you regulate what gets computed is going to affect the sector. So things like AI copyright, data protection, all of these things will impact the sector, will impact how you do things. So there as well, we always say we want a pro-innovation, pro-growth regulatory regime with guardrails where it makes sense.
And I think that is the perfect end to. I could actually talk for hours about this because I've learnt so much. You know, it's great having kind of overarching view of the industry as well as the broader ecosystem. And Luisa, thank you so much for joining us today. It has been a brilliant podcast, a brilliant conversation, and I'm sure that listeners will get a lot from it. So thank you so much.
I'm glad. Thank you for having me.
Thanks,
No
Luisa.
problem.
Great to see you. Thank you.